So when you think about the term stigma, you probably immediately think about concrete events and experiences that happen to people, things like hate crimes and bullying or being the target of stereotypes. And those of you who are psychologically minded might also think about some of the psychological responses that members of stigmatized groups have to these concrete events and experiences. Things like anticipating rejection or becoming hypervigilant to threat cues in your environment, or concealing aspects of your stigmatized identity if you're able, in order to avoid rejection and discrimination. And you wouldn't be wrong for thinking this. There are decades of research from across the social sciences showing that these are forms of stigma that matter for the health and well-being of stigmatized individuals. At the same time, though, as this figure shows, this is just the proverbial tip of the iceberg. Stigma is, of course, much broader than these concrete events and experiences. It's promulgated and reinforced through our social institutions, through the laws and policies that we choose to pass or not pass, and finally through broad cultural and social norms and attitudes that we have about members of stigmatized groups. And collectively, that's what my colleagues and I call structural stigma. And what our work is beginning to show is that these structural forces that operate just below the surface can have really profound implications for the health and well-being of members of stigmatized groups, including LGBTQ populations. So I'm going to present just a couple of really brief studies to give you a sense of how we've gone about trying to show some of these effects. So when we started this work, we needed to have a measure of structural and institutional discrimination. And we found that in laws and policies. So it will come as no surprise to many of you in this room, especially after April's talk, that there's enormous variation in the US across states with respect to the laws and policies that are passed regarding sexual orientation and gender identity. So this figure shows the distribution of some of these laws and policies here in the US. So states in red and orange are those states that have restrictive laws that are restricting rights and opportunities for LGBT populations, whereas the states that are in green are those states that have more expansive protections for LGBT populations. And not only is there variation across US states, but there's also variation across time. So this figure shows some of the changes that have occurred over the past decade. We've seen really pronounced improvements in laws and policies for some states, but no changes and even regressions for other states. And so this meant that we had a measure of structural stigma in the form of laws and policies that were changing over both geographic time and space. And so we were able to go about testing what some of the effects of these changes in laws and policies were on the health of LGBT people. So in the first, one of the studies that we did, if you could advance the slides, please. This is a study that my colleague, Julia Raithman, took the lead on. We've been interested in asking, do mental health problems increase among LGBT populations following increases in these laws that restrict the rights and opportunities for LGBT populations? So next slide. In this study, we compared changes in mental distress among lesbian, gay, and bisexual individuals and heterosexuals who lived in 3 states that had recently implemented laws denying services to same-sex couples and public accommodations in the year 2015. And we compared those to changes in mental distress among LGBT individuals and heterosexuals who lived in 6 geographically nearby control states that had really similar demographic characteristics but had not implemented one of these laws denying services to same-sex couples. And our data on sexual orientation and mental health come from these large representative samples of state residents. I should just put an asterisk here that this study did not measure gender identity. I could give a whole separate talk about how that's an example of structural stigma in and of itself in terms of the lack of data structures here in the US that have measures related to gender identity. But for the purposes of time, we can advance the slides so I can present the results that we did have related to sexual orientation. So this figure shows the changes in the percentage of adults that experience mental distress in the states that have passed these restrictive laws compared to control states stratified by sexual orientation status. So on the y-axis, the left-hand side was the proportion of the population that met criteria for mental distress. And on the bottom is the x-axis showing time. So 2014 was the baseline year, 2015 was the year the policy was implemented, and 2016 was the follow-up year. So if you can, great. So you'll see here that the only group that experienced a significant increase in mental distress during this time period were the LGBT adults who lived in one of those states that passed laws denying services to same-sex couples. There's no change in mental distress among any of the other comparison groups. And in fact, this was equivalent to a 46% relative increase in LGBT adults experiencing mental distress in those states that had passed laws denying services to same-sex couples, controlling for a whole host of factors shown there at the bottom of the screen. So this study and many others that we've done like it suggest that structural forms of stigma may contribute to adverse mental health outcomes among LGBT populations. And they raise the really important question of, do we have enough supportive mental health providers in those states that have these structural forms of stigma? We answered that question. This is a study that a doctoral student in my lab just published, where he came up with a really clever way of answering that question. So in this study, he measured the state support for transgender rights across 33 different state-level policies, and he identified in a separate sample trans-supported youth mental health providers. And on the map here on the right, again, is showing the distribution of these laws and policies across U.S. states, with states in darker blue, were the states that had less supportive policies, some more restrictive policies. On the next slide shows the results. So on the y-axis is the trans-specific adolescent mental health providers. These are those providers who indicate that they provide supportive mental health care for transgender populations. And on the x-axis is that law and policy indicator. And what Nathan finds is that these supportive trans-specific adolescent mental health provider availability was 3 times lower in states that had these most restrictive policies. And controlling for lots of other risk factors. And so this study is suggesting that structural forms of stigma not only affect people's mental health, but it also denies them access to the very providers that are most needed in these states with high levels of mental health burden. So these two studies are the bad news, that structural stigma can affect people's mental health negatively. But in another set of studies, we've been interested, in the last study I'll talk about today, in the flip side of this question. Namely, can we imagine a world that doesn't have these disparities? So what happens when we see structural forms of stigma removed from states? Do we see a concomitant decline in the size or magnitude of sexual orientation disparities in mental health? It's very difficult to answer that question methodologically, and in fact, we had to go to Sweden to do it because it's one of the few countries that, at a population level, has experienced significant declines in structural stigma over the last decade or so in terms of laws and policies, that also has data structures that measure mental health and sexual orientation. So if you go to the next slide, this will show just some of the laws and policies that have changed in Sweden. It's been much more progressive in terms of changing laws and policies related to sexual orientation and gender identity than we've seen here in the US context. So here are the results for the study. So on the y-axis, again, is showing the percent who met criteria for elevated psychological distress, and on the x-axis are the 10-year period over which these studies were collected. And you can see here really significant declines in the proportion of gay men and lesbians who met criteria for elevated psychological distress over the course of the study, much stronger than was observed for the heterosexual sample. But most interesting was what happened, sorry, go back just one, what happened to the sexual orientation disparity. So you can see here on the far left, in 2005, before a lot of these changes happened in laws and policies, gay men and lesbians were about 3 times more likely to meet criteria for psychological distress as compared to heterosexuals. But fast forward 10 years later, in 2015, following these declines in laws and policies that were restricting rights and opportunities for LGBT people, there's no disparity anymore. Gay men and lesbians are no more likely to meet criteria for psychological distress as compared to heterosexuals. So these findings are important because they begin to suggest that these disparities aren't inevitable, but instead are responsive to changes in the social context, and in particular to declines in structural stigma. So I'll end with the last slide. Thinking about stigma as a multi-level construct. Stigma occurs at the level of individuals, at the level of interpersonal interactions, and finally the level of social structures and institutions. And if we care about addressing the negative effects of stigma, we need to think about how do we target stigma at each of these levels, including the level of social structures. And so I think that's part of the great work that this organization is involved in, and I'm really thrilled to be joining the board and fighting alongside you in that effort. So thanks again so much for your attention.